Maybe the most dangerous thing people believe about intelligence is not that it matters too much. It is that it has already decided who they are. That by the time they are old enough to notice their own mind, the essential shape of it is already finished. The speed, the depth, the range, the ceiling. As if intelligence were a verdict handed down early in life, and everything after that were just evidence. And if you believe that, even quietly, it changes the way you suffer. Because then every moment of distraction feels personal. Every forgotten idea feels like proof. Every unfinished project, every slow thought, every struggle to focus begins to feel less like a state and more like an identity. You stop saying, "My mind is undertrained." You start saying, "Maybe this is just my limit." That is where the real damage begins. Because many people are not haunted by the fear that they are lazy. They are haunted by something far more private. The fear that they were meant for depth, but were never given the mind to reach it. And yet history refuses to sit still inside that belief. Einstein was not seen as obvious brilliance in childhood. Darwin did not look like academic destiny. Edison was dismissed before the world understood what his mind was actually becoming. So perhaps the question is not whether intelligence is real. Perhaps the question is whether we have misunderstood where it comes from. What if the mind you have today is not only the result of what you were born with, but also the result of what your life has been training it to become? Most people imagine intelligence as accumulation. More information, more books, more lectures, more explanations, more exposure. It sounds reasonable. In a world built on endless access, intelligence begins to look like a storage problem. Whoever gathers more must think better. But that is not how the mind actually deepens. Because a brain can be full and still be weak. It can be informed and still be scattered. It can recognize thousands of ideas and still fail to produce one clear thought of its own when silence arrives. That is the contradiction many intelligent people live inside. They consume constantly, yet feel mentally fragile. They understand more than they can express. They sense that something in them is sharp, but rarely experience that sharpness with consistency. And over time, a hidden confusion forms. If I have so much potential, why does my mind still feel unreliable? Why do I keep reaching for depth and landing in noise? Why does knowing more not make me think more clearly? The answer may be uncomfortable because it removes the comfort of fatalism. A stronger mind is not built only by what enters it, it is built by what it is repeatedly asked to do. That is why some people slowly become more lucid, more original, more precise. Not because they were given a different species of brain, but because they built different mental conditions around the one they had. And once you see that, intelligence stops looking like a number. It starts looking like a way of life. Habit 1. Deep thinking without input. One of the strangest things modern life has done to the mind is convince it that constant input is the same thing as growth. If we feel stuck, we consume. If we feel uncertain, we consume. If we feel behind, we consume. Another video, another book summary, another explanation, another voice filling the silence before our own thinking has a chance to begin. But a mind does not become deep simply because it is fed. At some point, it has to be left alone. That is where many people become uncomfortable. Not because silence is empty, but because silence removes the scaffolding. Without stimulation, the mind has to reveal its actual condition, its fragmentation, its unfinished questions, its dependence on external momentum. And yet that same silence is where higher thought begins. Not the fast thought that reacts. The slower thought that organizes. The kind that holds contradiction without escaping it. The kind that stays with a question long enough for the question to change shape. Einstein understood this instinctively. He did not only use mathematics to move toward truth. He used mental solitude. He entered imagined worlds and stayed inside them until reality disclosed something deeper. That was not passive reflection. It was cognitive endurance. Most people interrupt that process before it matures. The moment the mind feels boredom, they assume nothing is happening. The moment it feels friction, they reach for distraction. But boredom is often the surface of a much deeper threshold. Beneath it is pattern recognition. Beneath that is abstraction. Beneath that is insight. A mind that is never left alone remains dependent on what the world hands it. A mind that learns to think without input begins, slowly, to generate something of its own. And that may be one of the first real differences between a busy mind and a powerful one. Habit 2. Struggle before help. There is a kind of suffering people avoid so quickly that they never realize it was supposed to shape them. the suffering of not knowing immediately. Most people experience confusion as a threat. The moment something feels difficult, they reach for rescue, an answer, a shortcut, a clearer explanation, anything that removes the discomfort of wrestling with something unfinished. But psychologically, that instinct has a cost, because the brain is not strengthened by being protected from difficulty. It is strengthened by trying to organize difficulty from within. This is why productive struggle matters so much. Not because struggle is romantic, not because confusion is inherently noble, but because effortful thinking forces the mind to retrieve, compare, revise, reject, and rebuild. And those actions do not just produce answers, they produce structure. Benjamin Franklin practiced this in a way that now looks almost brutal in its elegance. He would read powerful writing, put it aside, and force himself to reconstruct it from memory before looking back. In doing so, he was not merely testing what he knew. He was training the mind to labor before correction. That matters more than most people think. Because instant answers create the feeling of progress without the substance of it. They relieve uncertainty, but they often do not transform the person who was uncertain. A mind becomes more precise when it is forced to search itself. And that process rarely feels flattering. It feels slow, it feels clumsy, it feels like temporary inadequacy, which is why so many people misinterpret it. They assume that difficulty is evidence they are not intelligent enough for the task. But often difficulty is not evidence of limitation. It is evidence that the mind has finally been asked to do something deeper than recognition. The person who cannot tolerate struggle will always be dependent on explanation. The person who learns to remain inside confusion just a little longer begins to build a mind that can stand on its own. Habit 3, writing to think, not to record. Most people write as if writing were a storage device, a place to save information, a place to summarize what they already know, a place to archive conclusions. But some of the deepest thinkers in history used writing for a very different reason. They wrote because their thoughts were not yet finished. Leonardo da Vinci's notebooks were not polished demonstrations of certainty. They were alive with fragments, sketches, contradictions, unfinished questions, strange observations, and shifting lines of thought. They were not organized because the mind that produced them was not trying to perform clarity. It was trying to discover it. That is the deeper function of writing. Writing slows thought down enough for it to become visible. And once thought becomes visible, it loses the privilege of vagueness. A feeling that seemed profound in the mind may look hollow on paper. An idea that felt complete may reveal gaps the moment language tries to hold it. A belief that sounded intelligent internally may collapse when forced into a clear sentence. This is why writing can feel unexpectedly exposing. It does not just express your thinking, it confronts it. And that confrontation is useful, because many people mistake familiarity for understanding. They read something, it resonates, it sounds true, and they assume it has become theirs. But recognition is not the same as possession. If a thought cannot be clarified, questioned, rephrased, or extended, it may still be living at the surface. Writing drives it deeper. It forces the brain to choose, to define, to sequence, to notice contradiction, to turn emotional fog into intellectual form. In that sense, writing is not only a record of thought, it is one of the places thought becomes real. Habit 4, building mental models. There is a major difference between having information and having a mind that can do something with it. Many people collect knowledge the way others collect objects. One idea next to another, one concept next to another, one fact laid beside the next fact, with very little internal architecture connecting them. The result is not depth. It is accumulation without transformation. A stronger mind begins to emerge when ideas stop existing as isolated pieces and start becoming lenses. That is what mental models really are. They are not just bits of knowledge, they are structures that help the mind interpret reality. Cause and effect, adaptation, incentives, bias, trade-offs, feedback loops, emergence, fragility, thresholds. These are not merely concepts to memorize, they are ways of seeing. And once the mind starts seeing in patterns, it changes. It stops depending so heavily on familiarity. It becomes more fluid in unfamiliar situations. It begins to transfer understanding from one domain into another. That kind of transfer is one of the hidden signatures of real intelligence. Because life rarely presents itself in neatly labeled categories. Human behavior is never only psychology. Failure is never only effort. Motivation is never only discipline. Reality is layered. A flexible mind can move between layers. That is why polymaths mattered so much in history. Not because they were trying to appear impressive, but because their minds became richly interconnected. One field sharpened the questions they asked in another. Biology altered how they thought about change. Physics altered how they thought about systems. Philosophy altered how they thought about meaning. Economics altered how they thought about incentives. And eventually, thought itself became more dimensional. A person with many facts may sound smart. A person with many models begins to see what others miss. Habit 5, deliberate memory training. People often talk about memory as if it were separate from intelligence. As if memory were clerical and intelligence were something higher. Something more elegant, something more abstract. But a weak memory quietly limits thought, because you cannot reason well with ideas you cannot hold. You cannot connect patterns that vanish too quickly. You cannot build depth on foundations that disappear the moment you need them. In that sense, memory is not beneath intelligence. It is beneath it in the architectural sense. It holds it up. Nikola Tesla became almost mythical for the vividness of his mental visualization. He could reportedly rotate machines in his mind, test them internally, refine them before ever building them physically. Whether or not one can reach that extreme is less important than what it reveals. A mind becomes far more powerful when it can retain, manipulate, and revisit complex material internally. Ancient thinkers understood this with unusual seriousness. Memory was not treated as a school skill, it was treated as a cognitive discipline, something that sharpened not only recall, but reasoning itself. Modern life pushes people in the opposite direction. They reread instead of retrieve, they review instead of reconstruct. They trust recognition because recognition feels smooth. They outsource memory to devices, tabs, notes, and search bars, then wonder why their thinking feels thin when external support is removed. But the mind changes when it is asked to remember, actively, when you pause before checking, when you explain without notes, when you reconstruct before review, when you try to teach an idea in your own language rather than merely stare at the original one. Those moments feel effortful because they are doing real work. The brain is being asked not just to revisit knowledge, but to rebuild it. And in rebuilding it, it becomes stronger. Memory is not merely about preserving the past. It is one of the ways the mind becomes stable enough to think clearly in the present. Habit 6, protecting cognitive energy. One of the most destructive fantasies in modern culture is the belief that a serious mind should be active all the time, always producing, always responding, always stimulated, always switched on. But the brain does not become sharper through endless expenditure, it becomes noisy. Charles Darwin's rhythm was not built around permanent intensity. He worked in deeply focused intervals and then stepped away, walking, resting, reflecting, leaving cognitive space between periods of effort. What he seemed to understand is something modern life keeps punishing people for forgetting. The mind is not a machine that improves through uninterrupted use. It is a living system that degrades under chronic overload. That matters because many people are trying to improve their intelligence while destroying the very conditions intelligence depends on. Sleep deprivation weakens executive control. Chronic stress narrows thought. Constant stimulation fragments attention. Emotional overload steals working memory. A nervous system under relentless pressure stops prioritizing depth. It shifts toward survival, urgency, reactivity, and then people moralize the result. They call themselves lazy, undisciplined, scattered, weak-minded. But often what they are describing is not a character flaw. It is cognitive depletion. A tired mind does not need more shame. It needs recovery. That is why boredom matters more than people think. Not because boredom is productive in some simplistic sense, but because a mind that is never allowed to be unstimulated never gets to reset its thresholds. It loses tolerance for stillness. It loses depth. It loses the conditions under which reflection becomes possible. Rest is not the enemy of mental sharpness. In many cases, it is the hidden partner of it. The brain does not only change when you push it, it also changes when you finally stop drowning it. In the end, perhaps intelligence has been misunderstood not only scientifically, but emotionally. People treat it like a verdict, a label, a ranking, a private sentence they must carry for life. But intelligence is more alive than that. It is shaped by what your attention rehearses, By what your habits demand, by what your mind is repeatedly forced to become. The people we now remember as brilliant were not always the ones who looked exceptional at the beginning. Often, they were the ones who entered into a different relationship with thought itself. They stayed with questions longer. They let struggle instruct them. They used writing to expose confusion. They treated memory as structure. They protected the energy that modern life wastes so casually. They did not merely possess intelligence. They lived in ways that allowed intelligence to grow. And that may be the part that unsettles people most. Because once you understand that, the story becomes less hopeless, but more personal. You can no longer hide behind the comfort of finality. You can no longer say, "This is simply the mind I was given," without also asking what your way of living has been doing to that mind. So maybe the real question is no longer whether IQ is fixed. Maybe the real question is this: if your mind is always adapting to the conditions you repeat every day, then what exactly has your life been training you to become? And if that question feels heavier than you expected, maybe that is not a bad sign. Maybe that is where the deeper transformation begins.